Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review is of the Bingo Long Travelling All-Stars and Motor Kings. Directed by John Badham in 1976, this was John Badham's cinema debut. He did a lot of TV movies and TV work. And this stars Billy Dee Williams, James Earl Jones and Richard Pryor, amongst others. This is an indicator release which is out on the 30th of August. It's by number 237. This is another classic indicator release, if you know what the words classic indicator release and all that entails, as far as the film, and that certainly I wasn't aware of, and to see it getting a Blu-ray release is pretty fantastic. This is about the Negro Leagues baseball set in 1939. John Badham actually watched, growing up in Alabama himself, he watched the Negro Leagues baseball. Badham was born in 1939. And this film is a comedy, but it also has darker moments, and it is kind of a bit melancholy. It's about the end of an era as baseball integration eventually happened in 1945 with Jackie Robinson, and then 1947 black players were allowed to come back into baseball, because black players did play in baseball up until about the 1890s. And then they were excluded and segregated, and that's what created the Negro Leagues, and has created lots of wonderful players that eventually got into the Baseball Hall of Fame. 30 or 40 years after integration, they finally were recognised. So this is about Bingo Long, played by Billy Dee Williams, who is a pitcher who's pretty much modelled after Satchel Paige to some extent, the famous Negro League pitcher who is in the Baseball Hall of Fame now. And it stars James Earl Jones as well, and he plays a character called Leon Carter, who's probably modelled on Josh Gibson, who's arguably was called the kind of black Babe Ruth at the time, for the number of home runs he used to hit. And they play in the Negro Leagues, but their owner is pretty cheap and treats them terribly. So one drunken night, James Earl Jones makes a suggestion they should make their own team and break away from the Negro Leagues and just go around the country barnstorming and picking up games wherever they can. I mean, it's good to see the owners are portrayed as cheapskates and just wanting the money all to themselves and treating the players badly, because that was exactly the same as the major leagues. Obviously, one of the reasons why the 1990 Chicago White Sox allegedly threw the World Series was because of their owner, Charles Comiskey. I'm not sure what his first name was. Comiskey was famous for treating these players terribly, and that perhaps was one of the motivations for allegedly throwing the World Series in 1919. So obviously the owners aren't happy about Bingo Long taking all the best players from the Negro League teams and then going around the country as the All-Stars. So they initially try and stop them by various nefarious means, and then eventually they say, well, we'll put a game together, your All-Stars against the Negro League's All-Stars, and if you win you can come into the leagues as your own team, but if you lose, the players that you took have to go back to their own teams on like half salary essentially, which was half of not a lot. And you could argue, it follows a kind of sports movie endings, but how it gets there is kind of full of surprises. It's a wonderful film. It will put a smile on your face. There is racial language in the film, as you'd expect, because it's actually portraying a time where not only black baseball players, but obviously black people in general, were not living in the best conditions in the States, especially in the South. Richard Pryor, like I say, is also in the film, and this is 2 years before Blue Collar. Obviously, it's a year before James Earl Jones would be in Star Wars, and Billy Dee Williams, it would be 4 years before he would be in The Empire Strikes Back. Ken Foree is also in it as one of Potter, who is the leader of the owners, who shares a surname with the villain in It's a Wonderful Life, surprisingly. Not surprisingly. So Ken Foree is 2 years, obviously, before Dawn of the Dead. Stan Shaw is in it, who you probably recognise his face, if not his name, he's still working, he's been in so much stuff. It's a fascinating film, again, with quite a lot of Vindicator releases. It's perhaps not perfect, but it will put a smile on your face. There's a character who at the start of the film gets beamed with a baseball and loses the power of speech, and he becomes the de facto treasurer who keeps their cash, because obviously they don't make that much money on the road. His arc might be hackneyed, but it's actually quite moving. Billy Dee Williams is a leader who's desperate to try and do anything he can to keep the team together through all the adversity they go through on the road, because it's a road movie as well. Billy Dee Williams, shows off the charisma that you kind of wonder why Billy Dee Williams wasn't bigger. And obviously James Earl Jones is James Earl Jones and is absolutely wonderful. But back to Richard Pryor, he plays a character who's decided his best way of success is to get into the white leagues, to get into the major leagues. So he is pretending to be Cuban, so he starts learning Spanish, because the white leagues will let you in if you're Cuban, just not if you're black. And then later on in the film, he comes back into the locker room after something happens, and he's changed his tact to try and be something else, which I'm not going to spoil, but that's pretty funny as well. Pryor is really funny in the film, even though he doesn't really do that much as far as histrionics. A lot of the time it's just a look that he'll give. It's just like funny. So it's interesting to see, obviously, before Blue Collar, which is a completely different film and obviously a lot more serious than Bingo Long is. The actual release, again, is another wonderful Indicator release. Obviously there's a booklet, but there's a commentary by Badham, which I've still to listen to, but the fact that he grew up watching baseball, you do make the connection of why he wanted to make the film. And then it includes an absolute gem of a piece, which is There Was Always Sun Shining Somewhere, which is life in the Negro baseball leagues. It's a 60-minute documentary from 1983, which has players from the Negro leagues talking about their experiences, and it's narrated by James Earl Jones, and it's absolutely fascinating how they went down to the Dominican Republic and Cuba and Mexico just to get a game, essentially, and then the impact of Jackie Robinson, which then led to the demise of the Negro Leagues, because the black crowds wanted to see the black players go into the major league. So when that happened, the Negro leagues pretty much just lost their crowds and essentially disbanded to a major extent. And again, that's what's kind of hinted at the end of the film. So yes, there might be perceived success, but then we know that kind of led to the end of the Negro League. So there is a kind of melancholy to the film as well. Even though, like I said, it does have comedy. There obviously is serious underlying issues that are brought up, and sometimes that tone, the mix of tone, doesn't necessarily work completely successfully. But there is just a wonderful sense of melancholy at the end of the film as well, because it's a film about the end of an era. Where was it? There's the theatrical trailer, there's a John Badham trailer commentary from 2013. So it's a really good release, and again, the documentary from 1980 about the Negro Leagues makes this really an essential purchase. You know, if you're into baseball or if you're into American history in general and social history and civil rights history. So it's a wonderful. I mean, I haven't mentioned most of the plot details, but there's just wonderful little set pieces and little scenes and little details. Again, there's a running joke of Richard Pryor trying to explain to somebody how batting average works, because he's not quite sure himself how to calculate it. And that's just a wonderful little running joke with Pryor's character. So it's funny, it's moving, it's serious, it's melancholy, it's historical. The team is loosely based on a team called Indianapolis Clowns that were about in the late 30s, early 40s, who were essentially the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball. So the bingo long travelling all stars and motor kings, you know, they would come on before the game and do Globetrotter-esque things with a baseball instead of a basketball. You can see their uniforms are pretty colourful. So that's kind of based on fact as well, because there was a team around that time that was did those kind of things to entertain the crowd, because it was part of show business as well. It's another little indicator gem. Again, it's rough around the edges. Again, there is racial language in it, but it's, for a debut feature, obviously Badham did TV movies before this. It's really good, great performances. Obviously James Earl Jones is wonderful, but really Billy Dee Williams' charisma comes through, and Richard Pryor is absolutely wonderful in it, even though he's essentially not a huge character in the film. Yeah, I would highly recommend it, especially if you're into sports movies or baseball movies, even though it's not. There's obviously underlying issues with the film that's not just a pure baseball film. Yeah, that's a fairly random review. Again, another random release from Indicator, but it's another example of why Indicator are so interesting. So, like I said, even if the film isn't a masterpiece, there's a lot to like about it. And again, it's another case of the extras being extra special in this one, because that documentary is an absolute gem. So thanks very much for watching. Please let me know if you have seen the Bingo Long Travelling All Stars and Motor Kings, which is a bit of a mouthful, and hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films saying farewell.